The machine gun barrel glowed cherry red in the darkness, steam rising from the water jacket as Mitchell Page fired another burst into the mass of screaming figures rushing up the slope. Rain hammered down through the jungle canopy, mixing with cordite smoke and the metallic smell of blood. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on October 26, 1942, on a nameless ridge 1,000 yards south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Platoon Sergeant Page, 24 years old, from Charleroi, Pennsylvania, was alone. Every other Marine in his 33-man machine gun platoon lay dead or dying in the mud behind him. And still the Japanese came. The battle had begun 90 minutes earlier when the rattling of C-ration cans on his improvised tripwire jolted Page alert. He had spent the evening of October 25th preparing his position, stringing wire across likely approaches, placing empty cartridges in tin cans to create noise. The rain had been falling steadily, turning the volcanic soil into bottomless muck. Shells from Japanese howitzers positioned west of the Matanikau River had pounded the ridge intermittently throughout the day, but night brought a different kind of terror. Through the darkness, Page heard them first, not the shells, but voices. Japanese soldiers, speaking in low tones, somewhere in the ravine below, perhaps 100 yards away, maybe less. He crawled to each of his 4 machine gun positions, whispering urgent warnings to his gunners. Then came the lights. Dozens of assembly lights flickered to life in the jungle below the ridge, a sight both beautiful and terrible. The Japanese were forming up for a major assault, making no attempt now at concealment. Page knew what those lights meant. This was not a probing attack or a raid. This was a full regimental assault, perhaps 2,500 men against his platoon's thin line of machine guns. His position was the southern anchor of the defensive perimeter, protecting Henderson Field, the only Allied airfield for thousands of miles. If his line broke, Japanese forces would pour through the gap and overrun the airfield. The air campaign that was slowly strangling Japan's supply lines would collapse. Guadalcanal would fall. The war in the Pacific might be lost. The first wave hit at 2 o'clock in the morning. Page gave the order to open fire when he could hear the clinking of canteens on Japanese equipment belts. The 4 water-cooled 30-caliber Browning machine guns roared to life simultaneously, their muzzle flashes illuminating a hellscape of churning bodies. Japanese infantry, bayonets fixed, surged up the slope in a human wave. The machine guns cut them down in windrows, but they kept coming. Veterans of campaigns in China and the Philippines, these soldiers of the Japanese 17th Army had been told that Henderson Field would be theirs by dawn. They had been told the Marines were demoralized, undersupplied, broken. They charged, straight into interlocking fields of fire, as if orders alone could carry them through walls of lead. Within minutes, Page's carefully prepared defensive position descended into chaos. Japanese mortar rounds began falling among the gun positions. Grenades arced through the darkness. One of Page's sections, 2 guns and 8 men, simply ceased firing. The silence was worse than the noise. Page sprinted through the darkness to their position and found carnage, dead Marines sprawled across their weapons, blood pooling in the fighting holes. One man, gut shot, tried to operate his gun with hands that no longer obeyed him. Page helped him clear a jam, spoke words of encouragement he knew were lies, then ran back to his own position as another wave of Japanese infantry materialized from the rain and darkness. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The second wave came before the first had even been fully repulsed. Page watched his remaining gunners fight with a proficiency born of endless training, but there were too many targets, too many directions of attack. A Japanese soldier, impossibly close, thrust a bayonet at Page's head. Training took over. Page blocked the blade with his left hand, feeling the steel slice deep, nearly severing 2 fingers, and drove his car-bar fighting knife up under the man's chin in a single fluid motion. The Japanese soldier died instantly. Page had no time to process what had just happened. He wrapped his bleeding hand in a torn piece of cloth and went back to his gun. The Marines were dying. Not from lack of courage or skill, but from simple mathematics. 33 men, no matter how well trained, could not hold a line against thousands. Page saw his gunners fall one by one shot, blown apart by grenades, overwhelmed in hand-to-hand combat. The 2 rifle companies that were supposed to be providing infantry support behind his position had withdrawn, isolating his machine gunners on the ridge. Page understood the logic those companies were facing their own desperate fights, but understanding did not change the reality. His platoon was alone, and they were being annihilated. By the 3rd hour of the battle, around 4:30 in the morning, Mitchell Page was the last man standing at his position. The last man conscious, at least. Bodies lay everywhere, some moving, most not. The sound of his own machine gun firing was the only thing preventing complete panic. He could hear Japanese soldiers close by, shouting orders, regrouping for another push. Dawn was still 2 hours away. 2 hours might as well have been 2 years. Page made a decision born of desperation and combat instinct, developed over 6 years as a machine gunner. He would not stay at one position and wait to be overrun. He would keep every gun firing, moving between them to create the illusion of a full defensive line. The Japanese, attacking in darkness through unfamiliar terrain, would not know that 32 Marines were down. They would only know that machine gun fire kept cutting them down. Page lifted a 30-pound machine gun barrel, scorching hot, steam hissing from the water jacket, and carried it to the next position. He set it up, fired a long burst into the darkness where he heard movement, then ran to the next gun. What followed was a feat of endurance and violence that defied human limitations. For the next several hours, Mitchell Page operated 4 machine guns alone, running from position to position in pitch darkness, through mud and bodies, under constant fire. When one gun jammed mud and water fouling the mechanism, he cleared it with hands that burned from the hot metal. When another ran out of ammunition, he sprinted back through Japanese fire to drag up ammo cans. When a gun barrel overheated to the point of warping, he changed it out, burning his palms on the metal despite the asbestos gloves that had long since been discarded. The physical demands were staggering. Each 30 caliber Browning M 1917 weighed 31 pounds without its tripod, another 53 pounds with the tripod attached. The water jacket, essential for cooling during sustained fire, added more weight and could boil off in minutes of continuous firing. Ammunition came in 250-round fabric belts, each weighing about 7 pounds. Page was moving these weapons, their tripods, their ammunition, through mud that sucked at his boots with every step, all while Japanese infantry attempted to kill him from multiple directions. He was running on adrenaline, training, and something else, a refusal to die that transcended rational calculation. The Japanese kept coming. Wave after wave surged up the ridge, each attack pressing closer than the last. At one point, Page looked up from his gun to see a pile of Japanese dead so high it blocked his field of fire. He had to physically shift his gun position to shoot around the bodies. The absurdity of the situation, being forced to adjust tactics because too many enemy dead were in the way, would have been darkly comic, if not for the terror underlying every moment. Any second could bring the bullet or bayonet that ended everything. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, with perhaps 2 hours of darkness remaining, Page experienced something that combat veterans rarely discuss, but all recognize: a dissociation from the physical body, a sense of watching oneself perform impossible actions. He was no longer Mitchell Page, the Serbian-American kid from Pennsylvania who joined the Marines at 18. He was not a son, not a brother, not a man with dreams beyond the next few seconds. He was a machine gunner, and machine gunners fire their weapons until they stop working or until they die. Everything else fell away. The world contracted to a space measured in muzzle flashes and the weight of ammunition belts. Time became meaningless. There was only the gun and the target and the trigger. Japanese officers, recognizing that frontal assaults were achieving nothing but casualties, began attempting infiltration tactics. Small groups of soldiers tried to work around the flanks of Page's position, moving through the jungle in the darkness. But Page had spent years training for this exact scenario. He knew how to read the terrain by sound alone, how to identify the direction of movement by the way vegetation shifted. He would catch the infiltrators in enfilade fire, shooting them from the side where they had no cover, and then sprint back to another position to deal with a new frontal assault. He was fighting a 360-degree battle alone, and somehow, impossibly, he was holding. The Japanese 17th Army had committed elements of the 2nd Sendai Division to this assault, some of Japan's finest infantry, veterans who had fought in China and believed themselves invincible. They had been told the Marines on Guadalcanal were demoralized, sick with malaria, undersupplied. They had been promised that Henderson Field would fall before morning, that the airfield's capture would change the entire trajectory of the Guadalcanal campaign. Their commanders had staked everything on this attack, and yet, on this rain-soaked ridge in the darkness, they were being stopped by a single Marine who refused to stop firing. Understanding what was at stake requires understanding the broader context of October 1942 in the Pacific War. Just 10 months earlier, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the U.S. Pacific Fleet and shocked America into war. In the months that followed, Japan had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed, capturing Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and dozens of island chains. The strategy was deliberate: create a defensive perimeter so vast that America would lose the will to fight, accept Japanese dominance, and seek peace on Tokyo's terms. By mid-1942, that strategy appeared to be working. Guadalcanal changed everything. The island, part of the Solomon Islands chain, had little intrinsic value. It was a malarial hellscape of jungle and volcanic peaks, inhabited by a small population of indigenous peoples who wanted nothing to do with either side's war. But in June 1942, Japanese forces began construction of an airfield at Lunga Point. That airfield, once operational, would allow Japanese bombers to cut the supply lines between the United States and Australia. Australia, already reeling from the threat of Japanese invasion, would be isolated. The entire Allied position in the South Pacific would collapse. The United States responded with Operation Watchtower, a hastily planned amphibious assault that landed 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. The Marines seized the partially completed airfield and renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, killed at the Battle of Midway. But taking the airfield was only the beginning. The Japanese, recognizing the strategic catastrophe of losing Guadalcanal, poured troops and resources into retaking the island. What followed was 6 months of some of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific War, a campaign that combined ground combat, naval battles, and air superiority in a 3-dimensional chess match where both sides were bleeding resources they could not replace. By late October, both sides were nearing exhaustion. The Marines holding Henderson Field were riddled with malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections. They were rationed to 2 meals per day, and those meals consisted of captured Japanese rice, supplemented with whatever could be delivered by risky naval runs. They slept in muddy foxholes, constantly alert for night attacks. The Japanese called these attacks banzai charges, but that term suggested a wild, disorganized assault. In reality, Japanese night attacks were carefully coordinated operations designed to exploit American weaknesses in darkness. The Japanese had trained extensively for night operations. The Americans had not. Every night brought terror. The Japanese 17th Army, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, planned the October assault as a knockout blow. 20,000 Japanese troops were concentrated on Guadalcanal, far more than the Marines could match. The plan was complex, multiple simultaneous attacks from different directions, designed to overwhelm the defenders and capture Henderson Field before American reinforcements could arrive. Artillery would soften up the defenses, Infantry would punch through in overwhelming numbers. It was the kind of set-piece battle that Japanese doctrine excelled at. On paper, it could not fail. Mitchell Page's machine gun platoon, positioned on a ridge that American maps would later designate as part of the Matanikau defensive line, was never supposed to face the entire weight of a regimental assault. Machine gun platoons were support elements, designed to provide covering fire for rifle companies who would do the actual fighting, but the Japanese attack had fragmented the American defensive plan. Rifle companies were engaged elsewhere, or had been forced to withdraw, or were simply overwhelmed. Page's Ridge became, by accident and desperation, the critical point. If Japanese forces broke through here, they would have a clear route to Henderson Field. The entire American position would unravel. Page did not know any of this in the moment. He knew only that he was fighting for his life, that his friends were dead, and that stopping was not an option. The strategic implications, the historical importance, these were abstractions that had no place in the immediate calculus of survival. But history was being made nonetheless, in the darkness and mud and violence, by a man too busy, fighting to realize he was performing one of the most remarkable defensive stands in military history. As dawn began to break around 6 o'clock in the morning, the character of the battle changed. The absolute darkness that had allowed Page to create confusion about his numbers began to lift. The rain continued, but the first grey light of October 26 revealed the full scope of the carnage. Bodies lay everywhere, Japanese soldiers piled in front of the machine gun positions, twisted in the grotesque poses of violent death. The vegetation was shredded by gunfire. The mud was no longer brown but a dark red, and Mitchell Page, blood-soaked, hands burned, barely able to stand, was still firing. The Japanese, seeing their position in daylight for the first time, recognized the impossible truth. They had been stopped by one man, one Marine who refused to die, refused to retreat, refused to stop firing. It was a moment that defied everything they had been taught about American morale and fighting spirit. This was not supposed to be possible, and yet here was the evidence, unmistakable and undeniable. A Japanese officer, recognizing that one final push might break through, rallied his men for a dawn assault. They came up the slope one more time, bayonets glinting in the grey light. Page, operating on instinct and muscle memory and nothing else, swung his machine gun to meet them. The burst he fired cut down the officer and several men behind him, but the gun, pushed beyond all mechanical tolerances, finally failed. The barrel warped, the mechanism seized. The weapon that had killed scores of enemy soldiers in the past 4 hours was done. Page looked around his position, no ammunition left within reach, no other guns functioning. His hands too burned and torn to operate another weapon effectively, even if one were available. The Japanese, though battered, were still attacking. This, he thought with a clarity born of complete exhaustion, was how it ended. Not with a heroic last stand, but with simple mechanical failure and the mathematics of attrition. He had done everything possible, and it was not enough. Then he heard it voices shouting in English, rifle fire from new positions. Reinforcements were arriving. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, responding to desperate calls for help, had fought their way to Page's Ridge. Fresh troops, carrying fresh weapons and fresh ammunition, were forming a new defensive line. The Japanese attack, already wavering after hours of failed assaults, broke under this new pressure. They withdrew back into the jungle, dragging as many of their wounded as they could carry, leaving hundreds of dead behind. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had been directing the overall defense throughout the night. He knew that Page's position was critical, but communications in the darkness and rain had been fragmentary at best. Only as dawn broke did Puller fully understand what had occurred on that ridge. One machine gun platoon had held off a regimental assault for hours, and in the end, one man had held the position alone. Puller, not a man given to excessive praise, would later recommend Page for the Medal of Honor with a citation that conveyed the stark impossibility of what he had witnessed. Mitchell Page did not collapse when the reinforcements arrived, though his body screamed for him to do exactly that. He helped direct the new defensive positions, showed the fresh Marines where the best fields of fire could be found, pointed out likely Japanese positions in the jungle below. He did this because it was his job, and because stopping, truly stopping, would mean acknowledging what had just happened. That acknowledgement could wait. The battle could not. The Japanese made 2 more attempts to assault the ridge as full daylight came. Both attacks were repulsed by the reinforced Marine positions with relatively light casualties. The Japanese 17th Army, having suffered thousands of casualties in the night attacks, had lost its offensive power. The assault on Henderson Field, the operation that was supposed to change the course of the Guadalcanal campaign, had failed. The Marines held the airfield. The Cactus Air Force, the scraped-together collection of Navy, Marine, and Army pilots flying out of Henderson, would continue their attacks on Japanese supply lines. The grinding attrition that would ultimately force Japan to abandon Guadalcanal would continue. It was only after the Japanese final attack was repulsed, around mid-morning of October 26th, that Mitchell Page allowed himself to truly examine his position. The 33 men of his machine gun platoon had been reduced to a handful of survivors, most of them wounded. 32 of his Marines were casualties, 20 dead, 12 wounded badly enough to require evacuation. The 4 machine guns were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Hundreds of empty cartridge cases littered the position, testament to hours of sustained fire, and everywhere, bodies. Japanese dead sprawled in piles, the carnage so extensive that accurate casualty counts would take days. Page's uniform hung in tatters, soaked with rain and blood, most of it not his own. His hands were burned from hot metal, sliced from the bayonet wound, blistered from friction. His ears rang from hours of machine gun fire at close range. He was dehydrated, exhausted beyond anything he had experienced in 6 years of Marine service, and he was alive. Impossibly, inexplicably, alive. Other Marines, moving through the position in the daylight, stared at him with expressions mixing awe and disbelief. How? The question did not need to be spoken aloud. How does one man hold off a regiment? How does anyone fire 4 machine guns simultaneously across hours of darkness? How does the human body sustain that level of physical and mental stress without simply shutting down? Page had no answers. He had simply done what his training prepared him to do, pushed further than training could account for, and survived because stopping meant death. A medic tried to check Page's wounds. Page waved him off, pointing to Marines who were hurt worse. The medic persisted, noting the bayonet wound that had nearly severed Page's fingers. Only when ordered by an officer did Page consent to having the wound cleaned and wrapped. He refused morphine, refused evacuation. His platoon, or what remained of it, was still in the line. He would stay with them until relieved or killed. The medic shook his head but knew better than to argue with a Marine who had just fought off an enemy regiment alone. Word of what happened on the ridge spread through the 1st Marine Division with the speed that only combat rumors can achieve. Initially, many dismissed the stories as exaggeration, the kind of tall tales that emerge from confusion and darkness. But as reports were compiled, as surviving Marines from Page's platoon and the relieving forces corroborated the timeline, the impossible story solidified into documented fact. Mitchell Page had operated 4 machine guns alone for hours, had killed dozens of enemy soldiers personally, and had held a critical defensive position that should have fallen in the first wave of attack. The Japanese, in their own after-action reports, struggled to explain what had occurred. How had a single defensive position withstood regimental strength assaults throughout the night? Japanese officers who survived the battle reported encountering overwhelming machine gun fire from multiple positions, suggesting a much larger defensive force than actually existed. Some reports speculated that the Marines had brought in reinforcements during the darkness, that artillery had been repositioned to support the ridge. The truth that one American sergeant with 4 machine guns had stopped them was too improbable to accept. It suggested a failure not just of tactics but of the fundamental assumptions about American fighting capability that underpinned Japanese strategy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle for Henderson Field continued for 2 more days, though the decisive moment had passed on the night of October 25th to 26th. Japanese attacks on other sectors of the marine perimeter were repulsed with heavy losses. The combined casualties for the Japanese 17th Army approached 3,000 killed, losses that could not be replaced. The Marines suffered approximately 100 casualties across all positions, a remarkably light toll considering the ferocity of the Japanese assault. The mathematics of the battle were stark. Machine guns, properly employed by trained crews on good defensive ground, could inflict casualties at ratios of 20 or 30 to 1. Mitchell, Page, improvising alone in darkness, had achieved something close to 100 to 1. The broader strategic situation on Guadalcanal would remain contested for months. The Japanese Navy attempted to reinforce the island through the Tokyo Express fast destroyer runs at night that delivered troops while avoiding daytime air attacks. American naval forces fought a series of brutal surface actions to prevent these reinforcements, culminating in the naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November. That naval battle, combined with the failure of the October ground offensive, finally convinced Japanese leadership that Guadalcanal could not be retaken. In December 1942, the decision was made to evacuate. By February 1943, the last Japanese forces had been pulled off the island and Guadalcanal was secured. But the outcome of the broader campaign was set on that ridge on October 26th. If Page's position had fallen, if Japanese forces had broken through to Henderson Field, the entire defensive perimeter might have collapsed. The airfield would have been lost, or at minimum rendered unusable for days while positions were restored. Japanese reinforcements would have poured onto the island. The campaign that marked the turning point of the Pacific War might have turned differently. Mitchell Page did not think in these terms. He was a platoon sergeant, not a strategic planner. His world was measured in immediate threats and available weapons and the survival of his Marines. But history is made by individuals in moments like this, when strategic abstractions collapse into visceral, personal combat, and one person's refusal to fail changes the trajectory of events far beyond their comprehension. In the days following the battle, as the wounded were evacuated and the dead buried, Page returned to his duties with the 7th Marines. He spoke little about what had occurred. Combat veterans rarely glorify their experiences in the immediate aftermath. The horror is too fresh, the loss of friends too raw. When fellow Marines asked him how he managed to survive, he offered only brief, factual responses: training, luck, the enemy's mistakes. None of it captured the full truth, but the full truth was not something that could be explained in words. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller submitted the recommendation for Page's Medal of Honor within a week of the battle. The citation documented the facts with military precision: enemy strength, duration of action, casualties inflicted, strategic importance. But between the factual lines was an acknowledgement of something beyond ordinary valor. What Page had done transcended the normal categories of military heroism. It was not one act of courage but sustained, hour after hour refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. It was physical endurance pushed past human limits. It was tactical brilliance improvised in darkness under fire. It was, in the truest sense, extraordinary. The Medal of Honor would not be presented until May 21st, 1943, in Balcombe, Australia, after Page had been evacuated from Guadalcanal and commissioned as a second lieutenant. Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift, commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, presented the medal in a ceremony that also honored Sergeant John Basilone, who had performed a similar feat 2 nights earlier at a different section of the Henderson Field perimeter. 2 Marines, 2 nights, 2 impossible defensive stands that collectively saved Henderson Field and changed the war. The coincidence was so improbable that some historians initially questioned whether the accounts had been conflated, but the documentary evidence was clear, corroborated by dozens of witnesses. Guadalcanal had produced two of the most remarkable defensive stands in American military history within 48 hours of each other. Page's response to receiving the Medal of Honor revealed the character that had sustained him through that terrible night. When Vandergrift told him he was the first enlisted Marine in the division to receive the nation's highest decoration, Page replied with words that would define how he viewed his own actions for the rest of his life. "This Medal of Honor belongs to all 33 men in my platoon on Guadalcanal." He meant it. The medal, in his mind, represented not individual heroism, but the collective sacrifice of Marines who had fought and died beside him. The fact that he alone survived to receive recognition was an accident of fate, not a measure of greater courage. This perspective, common among Medal of Honor recipients, who almost universally deflect attention from their own actions, speaks to something profound about combat and memory. The men who perform the most extraordinary acts of valor are often those least able to see their actions as extraordinary. From their perspective, they were simply doing their job under circumstances that happened to be documented. The real heroes, they insist, are the ones who did not survive to receive recognition. This is not false modesty. It is the authentic voice of someone who has seen friends die and carries the weight of being the one who lived. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Page could have returned to the United States for war bond tours and public appearances. Many Medal of Honor recipients were pulled from combat duty to serve this purpose. Their symbolic value as heroes was considered more important than their tactical value as fighters. Page refused. He insisted on returning to active duty with the 1st Marine Division. He wanted to be with his Marines, to continue the fight that had cost so many of his friends their lives. The Marine Corps, recognizing both his determination and his leadership qualities, commissioned him as a 2nd lieutenant in the field on December 19, 1942, while still on Guadalcanal. Page remained in the Pacific Theater for the duration of the war. He participated in the Cape Gloucester campaign on New Britain, where the 1st Marine Division fought through some of the worst jungle terrain in the Pacific to secure airfields and deny the Japanese strategic positions. The fighting at Cape Gloucester lacked the dramatic intensity of Guadalcanal, but it was in many ways harder, a grinding, exhausting campaign against an enemy who had learned to dig deep defensive positions and make every yard cost blood. Page, now an officer, led his Marines with the same competence and courage he had shown on that ridge, though the nature of his duties had changed. He was no longer the machine gunner personally operating the weapons. He was the leader planning the employment of machine guns, the officer making tactical decisions that would keep his Marines alive. The war changed Mitchell Page in ways both visible and invisible. The burns on his hands healed, though they left scars he would carry for life. The bayonet wound that nearly severed his fingers healed as well, though it left him with reduced grip strength and occasional pain. These physical reminders were minor compared to the psychological weight of having survived when 32 of his men had not. Survivor's guilt is a peculiar torment. It does not follow rational logic. Page knew intellectually that he had done everything humanly possible, that his actions had saved countless other Marines by holding the line, but knowing this did not erase the faces of the men who had died beside him, did not silence the question that haunted him in quiet moments. Why did I survive when they did not? The question has no answer. Survival in combat is determined by factors so numerous and random that assigning meaning to them is futile. A soldier moves left instead of right and lives. Another soldier hesitates half a second and dies. Bullets follow ballistic trajectories that care nothing for courage or virtue. The best Marines die. The worst Marines survive. Mitchell Page survived not because he deserved to more than his fallen comrades, but because in the chaos of that night, bullets and grenades happened to miss him while finding others. He survived because his body happened to endure stresses that would have killed many men. He survived because of decisions made in fractions of seconds, decisions that felt like choice in the moment, but were really the product of training and instinct and random neural firing. Understanding this, truly accepting the fundamental randomness of survival, is one of the hardest lessons of war. It strips away the comforting narratives that humans construct to make sense of violence. There is no divine plan that preserves the virtuous and punishes the wicked. There is no cosmic justice that ensures the brave survive and the cowardly perish. There is only chaos, and in that chaos, some people live and some die, and the difference between the two is often measured in inches and milliseconds. Mitchell Page lived with this knowledge for the rest of his life, and it shaped how he thought about his own actions and the medals and honors that followed. The story of Page's stand on October 26th became legendary within the Marine Corps. It was taught at officer training schools as an example of defensive tactics and leadership under pressure. It was cited in discussions of machine gun employment and the importance of sustained fire discipline. It was referenced in motivational speeches about Marine Corps values and the warrior ethos. But these institutional uses of the story, while well-intentioned, inevitably simplified and sanitized what had actually occurred. The legend emphasized heroism and tactical brilliance. It downplayed or ignored the terror, the randomness, the physical and psychological cost. Legends need to be clean and instructive. Reality is messy and often meaningless. Page himself contributed to both the legend and the reality through his autobiography, A Marine Named Mitch, published in 1975. The book provided a first-hand account of the battle, including details that official reports had omitted or glossed over. Page wrote about the fear he felt, the moments when he thought he would die, the physical sensations of burned hands and bleeding wounds. He wrote about the faces of his Marines, both living and dead. He wrote about the absurdity of some moments, the dark comedy that emerges in combat when the human mind tries to process the unprocessable. The book was not a typical war memoir full of heroic pronouncements and patriotic fervor. It was a more honest account, and therefore more disturbing. It showed that extraordinary actions do not require extraordinary people, only ordinary people pushed into extraordinary circumstances who refuse to give up. The publication of the book coincided with a difficult period in American history. The Vietnam War had ended in defeat and confusion. The military was struggling with low morale and public skepticism. Stories of World War II heroism were sometimes viewed cynically as propaganda from a simpler time when wars had clear purposes and victories were decisive. Page's account pushed back against this cynicism, not by defending the military establishment, but by presenting an unvarnished view of what combat actually demands of individuals. His story was not about politics or strategy or the righteousness of causes. It was about what happens when you are terrified and exhausted and everything is falling apart, and you keep fighting anyway because the alternative is worse. In the decades after World War II, as the greatest generation aged and their stories were compiled into the historical record, certain patterns emerged. The soldiers and Marines who had performed the most remarkable acts of valor were often the least interested in discussing them. They deflected questions. They minimized their own roles. They insisted that anyone would have done the same in their position. This was not entirely true. Statistical analysis of combat shows that only a small percentage of soldiers engage the enemy effectively, even in the best circumstances, and far fewer sustain effective action under the kind of stress Page experienced. But the deflection revealed something important about how these men viewed themselves. They were not heroes, they were survivors. The heroes were buried on Guadalcanal and 100 other islands across the Pacific. Mitchell Page spent considerable time in his later years working with the Congressional Medal of Honor Society and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to expose individuals who falsely claimed to have received the Medal of Honor. This work, which began in the mid-1990s, was driven by Page's deep respect for the medal and what it represented. He had seen men die who deserved the medal, but never received it because there were no witnesses, or because paperwork was lost, or because the chaos of combat meant their actions went unrecorded. The idea that someone would claim the medal fraudulently, would pretend to have done the things that cost so many their lives, enraged him in a way few other things could. The FBI investigations that Page contributed to resulted in over 100 individuals being exposed as Medal of Honor imposters. Some were simply delusional, creating false memories of heroism to compensate for lives they viewed as failures. Others were con artists using the medal's prestige for financial gain. Page confronted several of these individuals personally, and the confrontations were not gentle. He had earned his medal in blood and terror on a ridge in the darkness. These impostors had bought their medals at military surplus stores or manufactured them from cheap metal. The contrast was obscene. Page's work on this issue led to legislative reforms in 1994 that increased penalties for Medal of Honor fraud, making it a federal crime punishable by significant fines and imprisonment. This work also reflected Page's broader concern about historical memory and how stories of valor are preserved or distorted over time. He worried that World War II was being mythologized into a simple narrative of good versus evil, with the complexity and horror of actual combat being erased. He worried that younger generations would view the war as a kind of adventure story, missing the reality that it was mostly fear and exhaustion and watching friends die. He worried that the lessons learned at such terrible cost about the price of unpreparedness, about the importance of allies, about the dangers of fascism would be forgotten as the veterans died and the war receded into history. These worries were not unique to Page. Most World War II veterans struggled with how to communicate their experiences to people who had not been there. The gap between the reality of combat and civilian understanding of combat is vast and unbridgeable. Words fail, descriptions fail, even films and documentaries fail, because they cannot convey the sensory totality of being in combat, the smells, the sounds, the physical sensations, the temporal distortions where seconds feel like hours and hours feel like seconds. Veterans learn to speak in shorthand with each other, relying on shared experiences to communicate what cannot be explained. With civilians, they often give up trying to explain and simply change the subject. Page retired from the Marine Corps in 1959 with the rank of colonel. He had served for 23 years, spanning the entire period from the last years before World War II through the Korean War and into the Cold War. His service record included not just the Medal of Honor but numerous other decorations, the Purple Heart for wounds received in action, the Presidential Unit Citation, campaign medals from multiple theaters. But the decorations were, in his mind, less important than the relationships he had built with fellow Marines and the knowledge that he had served honorably. In retirement, Page remained active in Marine Corps and veteran affairs. He attended reunions of the 1st Marine Division, where he could talk with men who understood what Guadalcanal had been like. He participated in memorial services for fallen Marines, lending his presence and his story to keep their memories alive. He worked on rocket and weapons development, applying his decades of experience with military hardware to improving the tools that would protect future Marines. He was not the kind of veteran who spent retirement reliving past glories. He was forward-looking, concerned with the present and future rather than dwelling on the past. The question that haunted histories of the battle, how did one man hold off a regiment, admits of several answers, depending on what kind of answer one is seeking. The tactical answer involves machine gun placement, fields of fire, defensive terrain, and the confusion created by darkness and weather. Page had positioned his guns well. The ridge provided good observation and clear firing lanes. The Japanese, attacking uphill through jungle in darkness, could not effectively employ their numerical advantage. The machine guns, water-cooled and capable of sustained fire, could deliver far more firepower than the bolt-action rifles of Japanese infantry. These factors mattered. The physiological answer involves adrenaline, the human body's emergency response system that can temporarily override fatigue and pain. Under extreme stress, The adrenal glands flood the bloodstream with hormones that increase strength, sharpen focus, and suppress the sensation of injury. Page was operating in a sustained adrenal state for hours, which is unusual. Most adrenaline responses last minutes. Not hours, but not impossible. His body was consuming its own resources at an unsustainable rate, which would have led to collapse eventually. But eventually did not come until after the battle was decided. The psychological answer involves training, determination, and what the military calls stress inoculation. Page had spent 6 years as a machine gunner. He had trained extensively in darkness, in simulated combat conditions, under stress. His actions on that ridge were not improvised from scratch. They were the execution of procedures drilled into him through countless repetitions until they became automatic. When conscious thought became difficult, when exhaustion and fear threatened to overwhelm, cognition training took over. His hands knew how to clear jams. His body knew how to move between positions. His mind knew what needed to be done even when the why became hazy. But none of these answers fully captures what occurred. Tactics explain part of it. Physiology explains part of it. Psychology explains part of it. But the whole remains greater than the sum of parts. There is an element of Mitchell Page's stand that resists complete explanation, a quality of human will that cannot be reduced to mechanisms or training. At some level, he simply refused to accept defeat. This refusal was not rational. Rationally, his position was hopeless after the first hour. Rationally, he should have withdrawn or surrendered. But combat is not rational, and the will to survive and fight can override rational calculation in ways that surprise even the person experiencing it. The legacy of October 26, 1942, extends beyond Mitchell Page's personal story. It is part of the larger narrative of Guadalcanal, which marked the turning point in the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, Japan was advancing. After Guadalcanal, Japan was retreating. The campaign proved that American forces could fight and win against veteran Japanese troops in jungle terrain. It proved that the logistical challenges of operating thousands of miles from home bases could be overcome. It proved that the will to fight, properly led and supplied, could turn the tide of war. These lessons informed every subsequent campaign in the Pacific, from the island-hopping strategy that bypassed Japanese strongholds to the eventual invasion of Okinawa and the plans for invading Japan itself. Page's stand also contributed to the growing legend of the United States Marine Corps. The Marines had been a relatively small force before the war, often overshadowed by the Army and Navy. Guadalcanal changed that perception. The fighting spirit displayed by Marines like Page and Basilone, the refusal to surrender or retreat even when outnumbered and undersupplied, created a reputation that would define the Corps for generations. Send in the Marines became shorthand for deploying elite troops capable of impossible missions. This reputation was earned in places like that ridge on Guadalcanal, in moments when individual Marines made decisions that changed outcomes. The Japanese perspective on what occurred on Guadalcanal is less documented but equally important. For Japanese forces, Guadalcanal represented the first major land defeat of the war. It shattered assumptions about American fighting capability and morale. Japanese commanders had been taught that Americans were soft, individualistic, incapable of the collective sacrifice required for victory. The fighting on Guadalcanal proved otherwise. American forces, particularly Marines, were willing to endure hardship and fight to the death when necessary. This realization forced a reassessment of Japanese strategy and contributed to the increasingly desperate tactics employed in later campaigns. The human cost of the battle for Henderson Field was staggering. The Japanese 17th Army suffered approximately 3,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting, with the majority of those killed in the failed night assaults. These were not conscripts or poorly trained troops. They were veteran soldiers, many with years of combat experience in China. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies but the loss of irreplaceable military expertise. Japan, with its smaller population and industrial base, could not sustain these casualty rates. Every major battle in the Pacific after Guadalcanal saw Japan's pool of experienced soldiers and sailors shrink, replaced by increasingly green recruits who lacked the training and experience of earlier forces. The American casualties, while far lighter, were still significant. The Marines holding Henderson Field suffered from malaria at rates approaching 50%. Dysentery, dengue fever, and various fungal infections were endemic. Malnutrition was common as supply lines remained tenuous throughout the campaign. The psychological toll of continuous combat in such conditions was immense. Many Marines who survived Guadalcanal carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives: nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty adjusting to civilian life. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist yet, but the condition certainly did. Mitchell Page was no exception. He rarely spoke in detail about the psychological aftermath of that night, but those close to him reported that he had recurrent nightmares and periods of withdrawn silence. One of the more remarkable aspects of Page's story is how close it came to never being known at all. In the confusion of combat, with poor communications and fragmented chains of command, it would have been easy for his actions to go unrecorded. If the Japanese attack had succeeded and the Marine line had been overrun, Page would have been killed and buried with no witnesses to what he had accomplished. If the surviving Marines had not corroborated the details, or if officers had been too busy with other priorities to document what happened, the story might have been lost. The fact that we know the story at all is partly due to Chesty Puller's insistence on documenting extraordinary acts of valor even in the chaos of ongoing combat. This raises a broader question about how many similar acts went unrecorded. How many soldiers in World War II or in any war performed extraordinary acts of courage that no one witnessed or documented? How many defensive stands, small unit actions, individual moments of heroism disappeared into the fog of war without recognition? The answer is almost certainly thousands or tens of thousands. Combat produces extraordinary circumstances routinely, and humans rise to those circumstances more often than institutional memory can capture. Mitchell Page was remarkable, but he was also lucky to survive, lucky to have witnesses, lucky to have commanders who recognized what had occurred and took the time to document it. By the early 2000s, Mitchell Page had become one of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from the Guadalcanal campaign. Most of his fellow recipients had died, some in later actions during the war, others from old age and illness in the decades after. Page attended memorial services and reunion events where he was increasingly one of the few living links to that pivotal campaign. This position brought both honor and burden. Honor, because it meant his story could continue to inspire new generations. Burden, because it meant carrying the memory of men who could no longer speak for themselves. Page died on November 15, 2003, at his home in La Quinta, California. He was 85 years old. The cause of death was congestive heart failure, a common end for men of his generation, their hearts simply wearing out after decades of service. He was buried with full military honors at Riverside National Cemetery in Riverside, California. The funeral was attended by Marine Corps leadership, fellow veterans, and family members. The flag-draped coffin, the rifle salute, the playing of taps, these rituals, provided closure and recognition for a life of service. In the years since his death, Mitchell Page's story has been taught in Marine Corps professional military education courses, analyzed in military history studies, and featured in documentaries about the Pacific War. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects. Some focus on the tactical lessons, proper machine gun employment, defensive positioning, the importance of terrain. Others focus on leadership, how Page's refusal to quit inspired the men around him and held the line when morale was critical. Still, others focus on the human dimension, what it takes to push past fear and exhaustion and keep fighting when everything seems lost. All of these perspectives are valid, but they risk missing the essential strangeness of what occurred that night. It was not a textbook example of tactics, because no textbook contemplates one man operating 4 machine guns alone. It was not a simple story of leadership, because most of the time Page was completely alone with no one to lead. It was not a straightforward tale of courage, overcoming fear, because courage and fear coexisted in him throughout the battle. It was, instead, something more fundamental, a human being pushed to the absolute limits of physical and mental capacity, discovering in that extremity that the limits were further than he thought. And in discovering that for himself, he changed the outcome of a battle, a campaign, and ultimately contributed to changing the war. The specific ridge where Mitchell Page made his stand is not marked by any monument. Guadalcanal has several American memorials commemorating the campaign, but the individual sites of small unit actions are mostly unmarked. The jungle has reclaimed much of the battlefield. The defensive positions have eroded. The only evidence that anything occurred there is in archival records and aging memories. This anonymity is perhaps fitting. The battle was not fought for monuments or recognition. It was fought because in that moment, fighting was necessary, and Mitchell Page happened to be the man in that position at that time. The ground itself has no special significance. What gives it meaning is the human actions that occurred there, actions that resonate through history not because they were recorded in stone, but because they reveal something about what humans are capable of when circumstances demand it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.